It starts with the chords for the Wonderwall by Oasis. Every time I hear it in my mind. I feel a bit uncomfortable, to be honest, after hearing Commissioner Reding. I think showing to us how much we, if I may, we are missing that kind of leadership, that kind of clarity in terms of defining the objectives and then successfully achieving them. But the panel today will actually be a little bit about that. So within the next hour, we will try to very quickly go through past 20 years and see what have been done and assess it against the background of intentions that we had when proposals, actions, regulations were being conceived. And from that, we'll go to the future and we'll see what lessons that we have just found should inform our reflections on to the years to come. And we'll try to guess a little bit or dream and see what is it that we would like to have, what kind of democracy we would like to live in. I tried to attend as many sessions as possible today, and there's many quotes that I made, but maybe I'll be just referring to them during the panel, and then we'll also try to see whether the audience would like to interact with us during the panel as well. So feel free to raise your hand if you feel an urge to share your views. And without further ado, I would like to very quickly present my guests and then turn to our one online participant. Sadly, we are not here with Secretary of State of Belgium for Digital Affairs, Mr. Mathieu Michel. So this is a second panel in a row when a politician declines his presence. And I must say, you are actually the exception in this regard. You never decline once you accept our invitation. So we are very grateful to you for that, Mrs. Sippel. So Mrs. Sippel is a member of European Parliament from Socialists and Democrats. Congratulations on your re-election. We've shared already kind of bittersweet feelings about that. Matthias Vermeulen is a director at AW Agency, also needs no introduction. And joining us online from Warsaw, from my hometown, Katarzyna Szymielewicz, president of Panoptykon Foundation. Okay, so there's one question basically. What happened in the past 20 years that bothers you, that occupies you? What is it like we would like to share with us? And if you can put Kasia on the screen, that would be great. That's not happening yet.
Alex, please put the speaker on.
Kasiu, do you hear us?
Yes, I can hear very well. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for making my participation possible. Although I truly hate the hybrid format, it's neither being there nor not being there. I wish I was there on the stage. Kazik, you made this point already when introducing the panel that data protection is not an objective in itself, or not only, but important element of our democracy, of a bigger legal order that is supposed to achieve important societal goals. So also hearing Viviane Reding reminding us why GDPR was brought into life, I also want to go back to these reasons that make, I think, many of us believe in spending so many hours dealing with data protection, because we are not doing this out of, love for law and its interpretation and fighting over definitions endlessly. But I think many of us believe that by regulating data, the use of data, we can actually protect real people from suffering from real abuse of power that happens both in commercial environment and in the context of state power. and that we can solve some of the real world problems that our societies are facing. And this hope, this line of thinking is justified because quite a few of these real world problems have something to do with data, right? We know it very well. But do we understand the purposes of these problems well enough to find solutions? And to what extent the data protection can be a solution at all? I think we will be touching on these questions in our panel today. So, well, if you ask me, I think in the last decade, we discovered the need to protect humans from threats that were already on the horizon when GDPR was being adopted, but we did not fully appreciate them back then. And therefore, they became extremely challenging when approached from this individual perspective, from the perspective of individual right to be informed, to have transparency around data flows, to be asked for consent, to have access to data, the right to correct or the right to delete. All this is not extremely helpful in the environment where we are faced with a very different circumstances, the circumstances where we are making choices all the time, but these are facade choices. These are choices that commercial entities that have all the means to manipulate and influence our behavior wants us to make, but we are not really confronted with real decisions over our data. This is why for years I've been using this ugly phrase, digital biomass, to describe humans online. It's not because I like biomass, it's because I really think we've been reduced to this passive ingredient of a huge ecosystem we don't control, we don't comprehend, we don't understand. And against that background, we probably need very different tools than the ones that have been given to us by the GDPR. So what problems remain unresolved in this environment? First of all, our attention is extracted and commercialized by aggressive recommender systems in the sense that, all the machines we are using, they recommend us something, they curate us our experience, they offer us only a slice of possible online experience because there is so much out there that somebody has to do that curation for us. And that curation is power. That power is using our data, is using the fact that we are tracked and profiled and understood in our digital biomass. But it's not really about our privacy, is it? It's much more about influencing how we behave online, what content we consume, how we think, how we shape our opinions, including political opinions. And that's how we go back to democracy, to one of the keywords you are asking for this panel. Second huge problem, our behavior is manipulated by addictive and deceptive design, which not only leads people to sharing more data than I think they would share if they ever reflected on this, but it has very serious consequences for our mental health, for our physical well-being. So this is also more than privacy. This is also more than any other right. It's maybe about our essence of being free humans, free individuals, to shape our lives in this most fundamental way, because we no longer decide on how long we scroll, where our gaze goes, how our thinking process, our dopamine cycle works. We don't control that, but somebody else does or tries to do using our data. So against these questions, is this a failure of data protection enforcement that we're still facing them? Or is this the moment where we need to reflect on another framing, another legal framework that is not so much around individuals controlling their data and making choices with that regard, but much more about society deciding on where's the limit for the free market, where's the limit for things we used to call services, but they are no longer services. They are much more critical infrastructure being used to shape how very important processes in our democracy, in our societies work. If we approach it from that side, it's clearly not just about data protection. It's about many other values that we have to ingrain in the law. So acknowledge social responsibility of companies and states to protect these values, to protect them in a more proactive way. And I think we have it. We have that thinking in the second wave of legislation, which I'm sure has been also discussed today, Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act. And we will need more of that thinking because not everything can be addressed in this environment with data protection. I also have to say that so few of these problems have been addressed with data protection, even though a few of these tools are available. And I'm not going to dive deeper now. It's not my role in this panel to explain why GDPR has not been used to its full potential. I believe all of you have much better understanding of these reasons, but I'm hopeful that we are at the turning point where we are also reflecting on that. And there will be much more courage coming from DPAs, but also from the Commission with its new instruments to be more bold about enforcement of the whole package against companies that engage in these extractive, abusive practices and continue to do things that if you read GDPR with fresh mind, you actually see they should never be allowed. It should never be allowed to train AI models on people's data without asking for consent, and maybe even with consent, because consent is a fallacy. It should never be allowed to do advertising technology, to design surveillance technology the way it has been designed, and it has been in place for more than a decade, that is causing constant leak of data and is causing problems to all market players and citizens and states, except for intermediaries who are benefiting from this abuse. It should never be okay to design recommender systems in the way that their default version preys on data, feeds on people's profiles, feeds on behavior observations in order to manipulate the way we interact with content from the first second we are online. This is not safe default. It's not safety by default. It's not privacy by default. And still we have that. So I'm asking, what more can we do with regard to enforcement to bring GDPR to its full potential? I've read Council conclusions adopted in May, and I was surprised in a positive way to see that even the Council, not our best ally when it comes to these battles, is acknowledging the role of GDPR and other legislation with regards to these problems that they call societal effects of digitalization. And even the Council is acknowledging all these problems that until recently have been pushed away by companies and states as if they are not really problems we have to be solving, because this is humans who are responsible for not being polarized, disinformed, mentally ill, addicted, and so on. I think today we are in a very important, interesting moment of this debate where social responsibility of companies that are behind the scenes and designing these technologies has been acknowledged. And now, hopefully, it will also trigger a new wave of enforcement and new wave of legislation. I hope we can talk about this new wave of legislation today, but maybe it's enough for me as an introduction before I dive deeper in the new wave and take another minute of your time.
Yes, thank you very much. No, it really speaks to kind of my heart, this belief that there are societal challenges that are what the citizens actually demand the lawmakers to fix, and that maybe the GDPR, with its individual-centered kind of nature, might have some limitations. And you very clearly pointed also the kind of key issues that you think should be addressed. Just very quickly, back to you. 5 seconds question. 10 years ago, did you think that these issues that you identified, okay, some of them were not existing back then, did you think back then that GDPR will fix them, or you already knew that this is not enough and we will need at a certain moment a new wave, as you said?
As Panopticon and a few other organizations I know, we spent years trying to deal with these problems using GDPR. I don't know whether we are naive or we were just loyal to the legislation we've been fighting for. But I remember myself sending data access requests to Meta, back then Facebook, hoping that they will show me my profile and they will help me understand this and object to how this profile has been constructed. So we did try cases that touch on all these issues, including surveillance advertising, including the way algorithms curate our experience based on behavioral data. And I still think quite a few of that could have been achieved. But many of you will know the case that is still pending in Belgium, the case against a number of cases combined into one big complaint against AIB and Europe and Google on ad tech. At the point where we got Luxembourg to decide whether TC string that goes through ad exchange is personal data. And it took us, I think, altogether 6 years to go to that point. And then AIB said they actually like what the court said because they know they won't have to change much in their ecosystem. When we think the whole ecosystem just cannot be, it cannot work if GDPR is in place, really. There are moments like this where I think that we wasted that time. And I hope I will change my opinion. You will help me change my opinion. But there are moments of dismay and disillusionment where we see how strong market players are persistent in just saying that black is white, and how many institutions play their game.
Thank you. Matthias, what do you think?
Is this on? Yes, perfect. Well, when you ask me, what do I think about GDPR pro and con?
Sorry, one thing. Could you put Kasia back on the screen? I think it will be more human if that. Please, Alfredo, please don't. Colleagues, thank you very much.
Perfect. When you're asking about my hope and dreams and what I've been thinking about the success or failures about GDPR throughout the past 20 years, I think it very much depends about who I was at a particular moment in time, I think. So I think in the beginning, and I'm not going to lie, I hated GDPR. And I will say exactly why. There was a very concrete reason for this. I was a PhD student in 2006, if I can count correctly, writing my PhD about the scope of the right to privacy in Europe. And then the GDPR proposal comes along, and I was like, oh no, this is going to give me a lot of extra work. So then I did what all good PhD students do. I just said, this is an analysis of the right to privacy pre-GDPR. So then like I could easily discard it as well. It had a bit of an impact on the relevance, but that was okay. I didn't sort of proceed in academia afterwards. Then sort of a couple of years later, I was in the European Parliament as well at the long end of the negotiations and really seeing indeed all the lobbying that Commissioner Reding had described as well. And then I think there was just this sort of this sense of urgency and this sense of community, I think, among many of the people, many of those who are currently in the room as well, where we really would wish and hope that this is going to be the piece of legislation that is going to solve all societal challenges related to the use of digital technologies, basically. So that was sort of like the zenith of my hopes and dreams, I would say. But I think like I want to focus a bit more on like my last two roles and my professional capacity. In 2019, we set up AWO as a very specific new type of law firm that really had at the heart sort of data rights and the protection of fundamental rights at its core as well. And the idea was there just like you had the emergence of new law firms that were focusing on human rights law in the aftermath of, for instance, the UK Human Rights Bill, that we would want to set up like a similar bill that would actually protect fundamental rights. And this was all in sort of the aftermath of Cambridge Analytica, where one of my partners had been involved in the litigation in. And there the idea was really that our goal was really to do what basically is the one-line description for me of GDPR, and that is to empower individuals against powerful actors, be it corporate actors, be it commercial actors as well. And so we had this whole idea about that we could do this by focusing on individual claims, public law challenges, claims for mass misuse of data as well. And to be fair, like we have been successful and we've had like right to object cases against Meta. We're involved in sort of stopping facial recognition, rolling out in a couple of European member states as well. But at the same time, so there is this huge acknowledgement that GDPR has given us these new tools, these new rights, which really empower the individual. While at the same time, I am very worried when I see that there is actually a really big obstacle, I would say, or sort of a threshold, especially for individuals, to really make use of those mechanisms as well. There's a huge financial burden to start a lawsuit, for instance, as well. There's a huge knowledge gap often still about where people, organizations, labor unions are not really still do not fully understand what the scope of their rights is, basically. And so from that perspective, I think my main worry right now is that there is still this sort of this tension where right to privacy, right to data protection could still be this feature for the rich, for the powerful, which takes us all back to like the ancient discussion about Warren and Brandeis and sort of the right to privacy and so on as well. So yeah, I think that is, and then maybe like one last experience, sort of, I was also very much involved in the Snowden revelations when I was at the Belgian Intelligence Oversight Committee for a short stint. And there you could see sort of what has been the effect of GDPR in our relationships with governments as well. And I think there we have a very mixed bag. Like on the one hand, privacy is definitely front of center, and it's not like an afterthought when many policies, especially internally in governments, are being rolled out. But then I think, when I think then about the role of intelligence agencies, sort of the hunger for more data, and the capability of the GDPR to stop some of those collection practices, then I think we still have a lot of work to do.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Sippel, some years of experience in the parliament, a few minutes of discussion so far. What's on your mind?
To be honest, I was thinking, as being the only politician here, maybe I should start with the elections we are just coming from, because there is a link between the elections and democracy and data protection. And I think for much too long we were thinking, even though in the last years we made different experiences, but for much too long maybe we thought we are having democracy. It's there and it will never disappear. And even though we already saw in the last years that this is not totally true, after these elections, I hope everybody will realize that democracy is never in itself a given thing. We have to fight for it, we have to strengthen it. And I think someone just said that data protection is not a value in itself, stands alone. But data protection, protecting privacy, protecting freedoms, is there to protect democracy, to protect our democratic European way of life. And former Commissioner Reding talked about all the opposition we saw in the beginning, partially from governments, but also from big industries, so-called old industries especially. And yes, when we decided GDPR, there was a very positive, emotional moment. And we were happy to say we as European did it. We set the global standard for data protection. And really, as already mentioned, many countries in the world started to talk about GDPR, not only because if you wanted and still want to offer goods and services into European Union, you had to follow the rules. But even going beyond that, we saw that debate started about the added value of protecting individuals. At the same time, we are still fighting with these different ideas, yes, to strengthen and empower the individual to deal with all the rules and challenges, but also to ensure that the obligations are upheld. Because leaving things, and to be honest, I see it still sometimes both in governments and in big companies that they say, oh, everybody knows digitization, everybody knows how to deal with digital offers, services, people know how to deal with it, every individual can deal with it and do its own fight. But that's not good enough and will never work. And to be honest, there is one thing I really hate, and I don't see any engagement from any of our member states, that's the privacy. Are you going into pages in the internet? Have you seen what the cookies look like even today? And I have the impression it's even getting worse. Because sometimes you don't even have a choice. There are cookies. You cannot choose yes or no. Maybe you can choose only important cookies, but you don't get any description what it means from that service given to you. So you get a choice, you go to Google, start page, whatever, and you get the first 1, 2, 3, 4 offers to look into one or the other page, but they all want you to agree to some kind of cookies. So what will you do? I will not open those pages, but I think many people do. Because they are in a situation, they want to get some information. So there is really something in front of us. And when I look into the successes and what I'm still regretting, I think even though we have some obligations, especially for the big companies, for the big platforms, again and again and again, we see that they do everything to circumvent the rules. It's not only the principle of consent, that in the meantime doesn't make any sense. We are no longer talking about informed and real consent. The way you are asked to give your consent is not a free consent. So it's simply take it or leave it. So that's it. We are not there. So we have a lot of trouble still in front of us. And also we are always running behind those attempts of the big companies to circumvent the rules. So again and again, we have to rethink our legislation. Not that much GDPR in itself, but the enforcement steps that are important. Maybe also to think about other legislative files, like in competition legislation. What can we do there to put more power onto everybody to deal with the things? We also see that not everybody and not every government is really thinking about the added value of protecting personal data, and I think that's important. We are not talking about any technical data, but we are talking about personal data, data that are linked to the life of people, and which is becoming even more important when talking about artificial intelligence and how this is working. So governments are not even always convinced that it's a good thing to ensure that authorities like the data protection authorities get the necessary resources and the powers to do their job, not only to control and sanction, but help everybody to fulfill what they have to do to ensure data protection. And when it comes to the individual, I think we need, beyond legislation and beyond the individual, we need much more training and information for the people. We tend to say, oh, we have the digital native. They know what's going on. No. I'm always feel a little bit nearly harassed, afraid, sad when I see parents with their 3-year-old children being on a job and the child is sitting there in front of a pad or whatever, and the child is playing, using games, things, having apps. The child is playing, it's using the technology. But is it that that child knows what's behind? Is it that that child is aware that it's surveyed? And we know that especially parents are not aware about that. So who will tell the child how to deal, how to use all these things and how to be aware? And coming back to my starting point, talking about elections and democracy, it's not only that big companies, big platforms try everything to make profit while digging into the privacy of people, collecting more and more data, manipulating people. We also see that this is something that governments try to do, to survey people, to avoid that there is opposition, to avoid that there is opposition who can be outspoken. And that's a problem. And that's why I think we need to come together with everybody, with all people who want to protect democracy, who want to have a living, active democracy, and thus are interested in very good efforts to protect our personal data, to use data protection, and to make sure that there is a broad public debate why this is not any kind of a technical thing we may use or may not use, but that we are really talking about democracy, that we are talking about our future, and we have to do our very best so that everybody is aware about these things. And we also have to make sure that companies are aware. This is not only a burden talking about data protection. And of course, it does cost money to protect data. But it's also helpful for companies. And I think as European Union, with a global standard that we prepared with the GDPR, we also should be proud to show that data protection is there to protect democracy, that we are giving the good example to the world instead of giving up to those who are not at all interested in democracy, but only are interested in their individual profit. So I think we need a broad debate in society, bringing together those in industry, in civil society, in data protection organizations, to ensure that we don't forget about the added value of data protection for our democracy.
So you all identified very precisely, very quickly, very pertinent issues of societal nature. And I was sensing even some sort of fatigue or frustration with not successfully tackling them. And I also sense some sort of, be it through data protection or through other measures, doesn't matter. What matters is to address these issues. You yourself mentioned e-privacy, which is not a GDPR problem, right? But it is a privacy problem in its nature. So I wonder if we know what we need to do, and if some of you kind of think, well, you can do it through data protection, you can do it differently, what does it mean for data protection as a discipline in years to come? Wojciech in the morning said the very same thing you just said, that this is not about itself, it's about democracy. And I think this was the theme throughout the whole day. And as a community, I think we're very well able to quickly agree on where the issues are when it comes to on substance. So what does it mean for data protection? And to repeat the question from the introduction, how can data protection make itself useful in these endeavors that you drew a few seconds ago? It's a question to all of you, but please start.
But maybe I will start. I think maybe what will help is that data protection services, together with others, do not only talk about data, and I know it's difficult sometimes as an authority, but I think we need to be altogether more political. So not talk about the different rules, the different articles out of GDPR, and that you have to follow it and how to follow it, but to go more public what impact the following of the rules or not following the rules will have on each and every individual, but also on us as a society and on democracy. Some people might say, but we already know that. We have seen that, how people are manipulated, how it's used to organize that a government can keep and be in government, or how to avoid that opposition can be very effective in spreading their ideas. But then again and again, these ideas are gone away. And I think we all need to be more outspoken to have this line between data protection rules and why this is having an impact on our life. And I think this is not only something where we need to strengthen our data protection authorities. I think it's also a question for us as politicians to be more understandable, maybe, why we insist on these rules. But it's also a task, and I'm a European politician, I think it's also a task for the Commission. We will have a number of legislation. We already had it in the last mandate. We will have it in future mandates. And we see that we are talking about data, the use of data in nearly all areas of politics. Even in agriculture, we are talking about data, including personal data. So we have to make sure that each and every person talking about legislation understands that there is an issue with data protection, that there is an issue with democracy. And the Commission is the first one when doing an impact assessment. She's not always doing it. But also to look in the consequences when we create a legislation, how will this impact on democracy? And I think if then we come together from the different angles, looking into, taking it seriously, I think this will be something that can help us. And even though, just to make this final word, I'm really frustrated to see what is happening or not happening with e-privacy. This even more gives me a reason to continue fighting, because I believe it's high time to get more action there, and I hope to have many allies in the years coming, even in an ever more difficult environment in European Parliament.
Thank you. Matthias, what's your... sorry, Kasia, you want to go first?
Yeah, I can do strong +1 to unresolved problems that should have been regulated by e-privacy, but my hopes are that we can do something better at that point. I mean, I think that train has left a while ago. So we'd rather talk about Digital Fairness Act or more comprehensive regulation tackling issues that were supposed to be resolved by e-privacy and many more, like manipulative design, addictive technology. But Kasia, you asked about the role of data protection in all that. I do think there's a huge role to play, and we need, I'm not a big fan of complex legislations. Maybe it would be nice to have just one constitution for it all, but we live in a very complex world where that legislation will be complex, adequately complex. So we will continue to have rules that are for data. For personal data, we'll continue to have rules that are for non-personal data. We will have, I'm afraid we have to have some rules on artificial intelligence, maybe stronger than the ones just adopted. We need rules that tackle different aspects of that. But at some point, it all there are overlaps. There are problems that are co-regulated by a number of laws, and there is nothing bad about this. We encounter this problem when fighting for strong provisions in Digital Services Act. Many of you will know that there was a big campaign to push and incredible support from the European Parliament, thank you for that, to regulate dark patterns. Not because dark patterns have not been regulated in the past. We have had them regulated in consumer law, in the GDPR, but somehow the enforcement was not there, or maybe the law was not adequately precise or not strong enough to solve these real world problems. And then Commission came in the very last moment, I think it was already the trilogue phase, and said, no, we can't just have these new provisions on dark patterns because we have GDPR and UCPD. We have to refer back to existing laws. And I think we lost something over that. Yes, it's nice to have, clean, precise construction in the law, but the real world is not like this. These problems overlap, and there is a huge role that data protection can play in it, but only if we apply, only if the bodies that are responsible for enforcing it apply it with courage and understanding of the real purpose. So if we see that there is a huge company like Meta, but it's not the only example, others will try the same thing, is trying to force people to either pay with money for service that is not really service. It's not service for them. It continues to be service for advertisers. So it does not, it should not be paid with very expensive subscription. And if people refuse to do that because it's economically ridiculous to do that. They are forced to give data. If we see a situation like this, we have to name it for what it is and not just avoid being clear-cut on pay or okay. If we see abuse happening within ad tech environment, we have to call it what it is. Abuse and leak of data and business model that is not rewarding for any other players except for those who created this model. And if data protection is used to name problems and to be pretty clear cut about these moments where data are being extracted from us and the consent is just a fallacy, it's just a facade, I think then we can still get somewhere understanding that, yes, other pieces of legislation will be necessary because data protection is not regulating competition or is not regulating other elements of this puzzle, but it has to remain important element of it. And I would love to see this enforcement being much more consistent and courageous, especially with regard to things like surveillance ads or recommender systems.
Matthias?
I mean, I don't have too much to add to these very good contributions, actually. Like, it does sound like there is an emerging consensus about the fact that GDPR needs like a good PR agency almost in terms of like how to sell the message and what's behind the core of the values that it aims to protect as well. And sort of coming back on e-privacy, for instance, as well. I mean, God knows what's going to happen after 7 years, also in a new parliament and with a new commission as well. But and there was news yesterday evening as well that really was thinking about sort of one scenario where it could be phased out and replaced by 3 different legislative initiatives coming potentially from the European Commission. I think the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's call them this way. But one of them could indeed be sort of a focus on a sustainable advertising act that really looks into sort of all the actors and issues that are falling behind the cracks, even with all this new legislation that we have just adopted in the previous mandate as well, and that it focuses maybe not on what would be traditionally be considered as the privacy-related harms or the data protection harms related to a particular industry, but that also focuses on its role as a monetization engine for disinformation peddlers, for instance, that stresses that this is enabling ad fraud into the billions of euros as well. I think 178 billion by 2028 if we just remain the status quo. I mean, that's the definition of an internal market problem if I've ever seen one. So all the EPP colleagues in the room, for instance, like this is like one key reason why this is something that needs to be addressed as well. So lots of this it's about framing to a certain extent as well, but also indeed making it very clear and concrete about what it is that we are trying to protect.
But it's been several times during this discussion when in one sentence, I think each of you said, we might need a legislation on this, but data protection is also important. As if whenever we identify a problem, we need to repeat data protection is important. We are the Data Protection Conference. It's a Data Protection Authority anniversary, and we really believe in that. But somehow you kind of hint that you actually might be open to tackling it, more directly through legislative measures. And your kind of immediate maybe answer to that question would be no. But we also said that enforcement is needed. We need to be more political, more strategic. So I wonder. How do you envisage that in practice, given the framework that is created? Is it a question of culture? Is it a question of structural constraints that we have? Maybe one more thing. There was a panel before, moderated by my colleague Anna, and there was a discussion about reactiveness versus proactiveness, and Johnny Ryan had a fantastic phrase of strategic responsiveness. I think that if we knew that 2022 when we did the conference, we would have totally stolen that phrase. So we did the conference 2 years ago, and the conference was basically about the governance and making kind of GDPR operational to achieve these things that you are mentioning. And what I think happened after is that instead of I mean, what happened after was the procedural harmonization proposal, which comes down to debating complaints, which is in essence very reactive. So I got a bit annoyed during the panel because I thought, you just said there is many aspects of GDPR that are not reactive in itself, but what we did after 2022 was focus actually on those that are quite reactive. Does it say something about data protection? Is there something in the way we debated that we're maybe too shy? Maybe we need more Viviane Reddings in this community, or is there something about the laws that you think needs improvement in terms of philosophy behind? New commission, new mandate. The title of the panel is Fit for 44. How do you see data protection in 2044?
Okay, so I think first of all, it's maybe all of it. Talking about culture, I think the rules are clear regarding data protection. And we always made it clear that you can use data, even personal data, but it must be very targeted. But still, we are fighting sometimes with an approach that Jan Philipp Albrecht already explained while we were creating GDPR, when he said we should not continue building ever higher haystacks of data and then, for example, in law enforcement, try to find the needle somewhere inside. But we have to be aware that even with these digitization, having access to a lot of data and information, it's not helpful to simply collect everything. Even in law enforcement, you need to work in a targeted way. And this is not always happening. So the courts are working with that. For example, when talking about PNR, we have some good rulings, but still sometimes there is the thinking, it's better to collect everything. We might miss something. And yes, we might miss something, but that's always the case. We will never be perfect, even with all the data and all the digital files that we have. So partly it's a kind of culture. Maybe it's a misunderstanding of what can happen if we go too much into privacy, both from private companies, but also from authorities. But of course, yes, it's also a question of legislation. We are saying we are living in an open market. And in an open market, there are different companies, they are competing with each other. And by competing with each other, this will solve some problems. Because every company wants to be the best. But that's not happening with the big five, let's say it like that. The big digital companies. They are having a kind of monopoly. So where is the competition? And I remember that in the United States, there was a debate if we should destroy Facebook because it's too big. We in Europe were not that much in favor of destroying companies, but that's part of the problem. So that's why, yes, GDPR is fine, but nevertheless, there are different aspects that we have to strengthen and adopt, and our world is developing, society is changing. So of course, there is always a reason to look into the whole environment of GDPR to see, is there something that we have to improve when it comes to the enforcement of GDPR? Is there anything around that we have to change, have to adapt so that it really can work? That's a normal process. But the point is that we all have to do it and have to look for the rules so that we can protect and strengthen GDPR in ever evolving and changing environments.
Thank you. Katarzyna, maybe over to you. What is the color of the future for you?
I understand you are forcing us to discuss the potential reform of the data protection law and steering us away from discussing reforming or creating other legislations.
No, sorry, no. If I may interrupt you, that was not an intention. The intention is actually to think about the data protection as a discipline and its usefulness in years to come. Of course, in practice, it comes down, to the forbidden question about the reopening of the GDPR. But I don't want, this discussion to be, that simplistic. That it's not only about that. But sorry, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I totally agree. We should never open GDPR, or not before we solve our democracy. Okay, maybe that's the right thing to say. Or I'm just as many of us, too tired after recent fights that have been difficult enough, fighting for high quality legislation in the new domains. But yes, speaking seriously, of course there are problems with procedure, for example, that are very well defined, and it's good that somebody is tackling them. It's good that we have this new regulation coming up on that is trying to solve some of these procedural problems. But it's another legislation that needs to be high quality and thoughtful and implemented in a way that that it can serve its purpose and not just another facade, so to say, like fake reform that will not ever perform that function. And I think for this one, if trilogues end on the version adopted in the European Parliament, we can really talk about changing procedures for better. If the Commission version wins, I'm not sure of that. So it just shows how complex every legal reform is. I'm not calling for one for GDPR, not at all. I think that we have so much to extract from this old but still very strong and wise in principles legislation that we need another maybe decade before even reflecting on reopening it. But that decade should be spent actively interpreting it by bodies who understand the purpose. Viviane Reding made it clear that her intention was not to regulate a corner shop, but more the big players. But the communication around GDPR, as many of you will remember, was entirely different. All across Europe, people were worried about hairdressers and small shops being killed by complex privacy policies. And what happened? None of the small shops was killed, and the big players are stronger than ever, and their privacy policies written in a very accessible, very friendly language. They mean nothing. They change nothing when it comes to their practices. And we can only change, I think we can only change their practices, the big players, with competition law, with measures like the ones the European Commission has now under DSA and DMA, because this is where we can prevent problems from escalating, where we can punish them for causing systemic problems without being forced to prove things that might not be provable in the complexity of technology we're facing. So yeah, thinking about the discipline, I think the discipline has so many unanswered questions. So many questions should be clarified by guidelines, from EDPB, with decisions coming from courageous DPAs, with academic work. So yeah, there is a lot for us to do to be able to continue with that discipline, I think. We shall not worry that it will lose its legitimacy, not at all.
Thank you.
GDPR in 2044. I think I have two hopes. The first one is that we're all maybe not going to be here discussing GDPR in a venue like this, but that it's taken for granted as part of our digital constitution, and that it's as obvious as the right to dignity in the European Convention on Human Rights, that there is agreement and that we have 20 years to solve all the problems that Kasia has mentioned as well, and that there is this sort of common baseline of enforcement and understanding. Then I think my second hope is that we kill the zombie files. And with that I mean this sort of, and I think there's many people in the room here, like we have been witnessing so many times like this sort of trajectory where legislative proposals, which are often very problematic from a GDPR perspective or a privacy perspective, have been launched. They are debated at length. We try to come up with consensus arguments, and then actually there is a sort of emerging consensus that we are not going to do this. But then, after a long period of silence, they're back again. They're mutated. There's like a 10% change. That's why they're zombie files. But I wish we could kill some of these debates as well. Like today, I think very topical, the whole discussion about the role of encryption as well, the discussion on data retention as well. I think we are in round 3 or 4 in the past 20 years as well. And so I hope that some of these zombie files, that we've killed them in the next 20 years.
Okay, so killing zombies is our first on the to-do list. I mean, I would like to thank you very much for this, very, detailed homework that we all gathered here will live with. But I would like to finish with how we started. So we started with democracy, with state. We wanted to discuss this given the EDPS particular role as a supervisory authority solely of public authorities. And both you and you, Wojciech, and also many speakers here alerted about democracy. And I'm very glad that the discussion today, this one or the previous ones, were kind of putting data protection in a broader context of objectives it should serve. And I'm glad that we have that kind of shared feeling here. If this is the product of this conference, then that's fantastic. But I was wondering whether you have, last thoughts when it comes strictly to state powers, state data processing. You all touched upon different phenomena, different problems that might come from private companies, private actors. Your one wish or your worry about states, both, either here in Europe or externally, if you want to also share something about this. Whoever wants to go first. I think Katarzyna should go first as a representative of a foundation that has recently successfully defeated its government in the case that Joe Kanatachi was mentioning a couple of hours ago, the case about the use of spyware by the government. So first of all, congratulations on this. It was a fantastic job, and I think the one that will be kind of a landmark judgment for many other countries to follow or ignore. So, Kasiu, over to you.
Well, yes, thank you. 7 years of fighting the case in Strasbourg, only to hear that the government has heard us and they will do the reform when they are ready. Well, that's part of our job, of course. But if you ask for my wishes or recommendations for the states, I really wish that this political effort that we see in fighting for exceptions and exemptions from all regulations. We had GDPR, and then we had a directive that is half empty. We have AI Act, which I'm not a big fan of, but with the exemptions that states were fighting for, it's even less meaningful, if not to say completely meaningless on law enforcement. So instead of seeing this desperate effort to always have their sovereignty protected from you telling them what to do, I'd really rather see them reforming the C states, putting effort in reforming their safeguards, bodies that should be in place, or like in Poland, they are not, but they should be in place to control the surveillance powers. Yes. Right now, from all meaningful legislations I can think of, law enforcement is predominantly exempted, and we really can't use any of the rights we have, even if these rights are weak anyways. We cannot even come with the most basic rights and discuss protections, ask for protections when it comes to law enforcement, as if we were enemies, as if there was state still in this position of don't ask us, don't investigate, don't dare to look into our black boxes, as if they were not working for us, as if it was not all about trust. I think we got to the point in which it can't continue if we want to call this system democracy, if we want to rebuild the trust that is so desperately needed to stop populism from winning over everything else. We really need states to reflect on how to make these protections real. And it's not about laws, really. It's about them building real institutions, building real procedures having real procedures in place that will pursue the same values that we have in GDPR, in AI Act, and legislations, even without being forced to do so. I know EU legally cannot force member states to comply, but member states themselves can show that they treat these values with respect, they interpret these values their own way, and they build institutions around this. So the same energy that goes into saying, don't call us out on surveillance, in my opinion, should go into building institutions that will give us the sense that state protects us and we can really trust it, that we play together the same game and not it's played against us, citizens.
I hope everybody has heard it. You can also watch the recording of it and memorize it by heart after the panel. Matthias, what's your take?
Again, not so much to add there as well, I think. I think comparatively speaking, we are still quite lucky to be in Brussels compared to many different and other regimes outside of the European Union as well. But I think like to remain and keep that position, we need to have a vigilant civil society, and that includes MEPs, EDPS, academics as well, who just keep on stressing the necessary safeguards and oversight mechanisms as well, actually. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Would you like to conclude?
I hope I can make it in maybe 2 or 3 sentences. I fully agree that democracy only exists if we have strong societies, NGOs, many others. And regarding governments, I'm fully aware that in these days we have a lot of challenges in front of us in different political areas. But for governments in a democracy, the main thing should always be whatever we do, whatever the challenges are, it's our main task to ensure the triangle of democracy, rule of law, and fundamental rights. And if we forget about that, then everything else we do may not be worth doing it. So that's the main challenge for governments beyond having a strong and active society.
Thank you very much. Guys, we are past the time, but I'm sure we still have a second for a few questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you have any. I see some people sticking out for the cocktails reception, but that's not gonna start until we finish the meeting here. All right, I don't see anything. Yes. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Kasia. Thank you, Matthias. Thank you, Mrs. Sippel, for being here. Thank you all for staying. Now it's over to Leo, EDPS Secretary General, to conclude. And please give it up to my fantastic guest today.